This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. My guest today is Madison Koenig, and Madison is the Women's Affairs Commissioner on the Student Senate, Ohio University Student Senate. And just what does that involve, Madison?
Being the Women's Affairs Commissioner involves trying to advocate for women students at Ohio University. So we've done some resolutions about the Survivor Advocacy Program and trying to show our support for them. And it also involves doing some programming events, like starting a new organization for women at Ohio University called the Women's Association, and planning Take Back the Night.
Oh, yes. The Women's Association, you say it's a new group, actually. And they were the ones that sponsored the events last week, right?
Yeah, so we started the Women's Association to sort of give women students at Ohio University who are in different organizations a place to come together and talk about issues that affect all of us and that are important for all of us. And so as our first big event as a new group, we hosted Empowering Women of Ohio Week with events every day last week.
Oh my, that must have kept you busy.
It was a pretty busy week, but it was worth it.
Good. Well, I was on the panel, and a little later in the program, we're going to see part of the panel that you had that first night, which was about the history of, especially of Ohio women at the university. Not necessarily Ohio women, but women at Ohio University. Yeah. We also have some background, actually, by Dr. Catherine Jellison, the chair of the history department, who talks about the emergence of the American women's movement and so on. And then I talk about some of the more recent events that have happened here in town, and which affect, of course, the women at Ohio University. So what else did you have last week?
So on Tuesday, we had a panel discussion about intersectional, on Tuesday we watched a documentary. I'm getting my days mixed up. We watched a documentary about women who are transgender, their experiences when they're in prison, because our Thursday keynote was going to be a woman who works on health in prison. So we watched the documentary at Donkey Coffee to give us a little bit of background information. And then on Wednesday, we talked about sexual violence and how it affects women of color differently than it affects white women. Mostly about how women of color don't necessarily feel as safe going to talk to the police and using the police and the state as resources for dealing with sexual violence, and maybe some ways that we could think outside of the box to make things better.
Well, and of course, that's a very difficult topic for women to talk about, black, white, or whatever, violence against women. And so then on Thursday, you had the speaker who talked about women in prison.
Yeah, our speaker was a nurse at the Marysville Correctional Facility, but she had worked in several different prisons in Ohio. And she talked about the difficulty that women have receiving health care when they're in prison, but also just like being educated about their own health care and their own issues.
Yes. I remember reading about it in the Athens News. They had a write-up, something like, orange is the new black, or is orange the new black? And for a long time I thought, wonder what they're talking about, orange, what the heck is orange? And then all of a sudden I remembered, that orange is what the prisoners wear, isn't it? When they're out.
Orange is the New Black is a TV show that's about women in prison.
Okay.
But our speaker said that, the TV show is meant to be entertaining, and these women's lives are not always so entertaining.
No, I guess not in prison. So then what did you have on Friday?
Friday we had a pretty intimate discussion with the assistant dean of my college, the Honors Tutorial College. Her name is Carrie Frith, and she's worked in a variety of different fields throughout her career. And she talked a little bit about how, as a woman, she's faced different expectations in the workplace and how she kind of negotiated that, and really just gave the female students who were in the room a lot of really good advice and posed some really tough questions.
Ah, good, yes. Well, I remember Honors Tutorial College quite well. Peggy Cohn, Dr. Peggy Cohn was the head of Honors Tutorial College for many years.
Right.
She's been retired now for quite some time. In fact, most of the people that I know at Ohio University are retired now, including Dr. Peggy Cohn. But that's a wonderful special program here at Ohio University, Honors Tutorial College.
Yeah, I feel like I've been pretty lucky to be a part of it.
Do you have special seminars?
Yeah, we have a seminar that all the freshmen are required to take to get to know each other and get to know sort of what the expectations are for them as students. And then you kind of go off into your special fields of study. But there are options to take seminars on interdisciplinary topics. Like I took one on international justice, and we looked at a lot of different cases throughout the world and throughout history.
But there is a lot of individual work, isn't there?
Yeah.
Mostly individual work, I guess. And you work directly with professors. And I know my husband, who was in the history department here for a number of years, had some occasional honors tutorial students who wanted to talk, about his general area, which was modern European diplomatic history, Spanish Civil War, the rise of Hitler, and so on. And so it's been one of the very special parts of Ohio University to have Honors Tutorial College.
Yeah.
And you're a graduating senior?
I am, yeah.
Will you be going back to Cincinnati?
I think for a little bit. I'm still trying to figure out what the next step is for me.
Oh, sure. Well, it's always a big time when all of a sudden you come to graduation time. I wanted to mention this book that I have called Remember the Ladies, which was something that Mrs. John Adams said.
Yeah.
That's a picture of her. Remember the ladies, and she wrote him that when he was working on the Declaration of Independence back in 1776.
He didn't really follow her advice, did he?
I don't think so, but they have wonderful correspondence because they were so, not close together so much. He was in England for years, and he was away in Washington, D.C.,
Right.
And until he was president in 1796, they often were apart a good deal. But I wanted to mention that since we're taping on April 10th, that in my book of birthdays and death dates, there is a picture of Clare Boothe Luce. And she was a very interesting woman, contemporary of my mother, really. She was born in 1903. And she was an author, an editor. She was an actress. She was a diplomat. She was ambassador to Italy, I believe, under President Eisenhower's time. She was a very active Republican activist and the wife of Henry Luce, who published Time and Life back in those days. So she was a well-known woman in her time. And, of course, she wrote a play called The Women, which is, have you ever seen that? It's unusual in that there are no men in the movie.
No, I've never seen it.
No men. They talk about men constantly, but there are no men really in the movie itself. But that was Clare Boothe Luce, and she had quite an interesting life. And it's about time for us to switch over to see some pictures upcoming and to see the time that we had last Monday, week ago Monday, on the status of women, the status of women in Ohio University in Athens.
Yeah.
And we'll follow up.
University level was quite a new phenomenon at the time that Maggie Boyd comes to school here at Ohio University. The first college that had admitted a woman, or a group of women, was a private college here in the state of Ohio, Oberlin College, with a strong abolitionist movement centered there on its campus. And of course, African Americans, male and female, were quite active in the abolitionist movement of the 1830s, as were women, white and African American women were very active in the movement to end slavery. And in fact, the first women's movement was an outgrowth of the abolitionist movement. The first women's rights meeting was held in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, and the people who were in attendance were veterans of the abolitionist movement. So 1837 is the first time women are allowed a higher education in the U.S., initially at a private organization, a private institution, Oberlin College. The first public university to allow women in its doors is one of my alma maters, the school where I received my PhD, the University of Iowa. And that university let women in the door in 1847. Although, you know, that was the policy. The first female students didn't actually matriculate until a few years later. So we have a few instances prior to the Civil War of women being educated in a co-educational environment, but it really takes off women's higher education in the years following the Civil War. And a turning point is with the founding of the so-called Seven Sisters Colleges. And the first of the Seven Sisters Colleges, Vassar, was founded the first year of the Civil War, 1861. The Seven Sisters Colleges are all located in the Northeast. As I said, Vassar's the first in 1861. And then in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, we had the founding of the other 6 colleges in the Seven Sisters grouping. Wellesley, probably heard of all these schools. Wellesley, Smith, Bryn Mawr, Radcliffe, Barnard, and Mount Holyoke. And these were schools that were created for members of the Northeastern white elite. They were seen as the women's school counterparts to the all-male, at that time, Ivy League universities. So for instance, Radcliffe was the female version of Harvard. Barnard was the female version of Columbia University, etc. And one reason that we see women's higher education expanding in the post-Civil War decades of the 19th century is in part because there is an organized women's movement, as I said, founded in Seneca Falls, New York, 1848. And in the document that created the 19th century women's movement, the Declaration of Sentiments, everyone remembers who has studied this document that it calls for women's right to vote. But it also calls for a number of other reforms that certainly don't seem unusual to us now, but were quite controversial in 1848. That women should have equal access with men to the professions, that women as well as men should be seen as the legal guardians of their own children. And one of the calls in the Declaration of Sentiments is that women should have an equal education to men. So the organized women's movement had pushed for the expansion of women's higher education beyond Oberlin and the University of Iowa. And it was also a period of time in which women in the urban areas of America, middle class women in the urban areas of America, were limiting their fertility, were having fewer children, and had more years of their lives that were dedicated solely to the care and raising of children. And among the reformers who said, well, women need to be educated to do other things in their lives besides be wives and mothers, was a woman named Catherine Beecher. She was from a famous family of abolitionists and reformers. Her sister was Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Catherine Beecher said, we need to have female teachers, primary school teachers. because who better than the women of America with all their natural nurturing skills that they're using with their own children to teach young children. And so Catherine Beecher used as her experiment the state of Ohio. She said, let's feminize the teaching profession and urge upon school boards that young women are the appropriate teachers for primary school, elementary school kids. And also, by the way, you can pay them less than you can pay male teachers. So she really was, it was the financial argument that sold a lot of the school boards here in Ohio. Yeah, let's hire women teachers. And the idea became that the best women teachers will be college-educated teachers. And so the feminization of the teaching profession also led to this greater inclusion of women in higher education following the Civil War. As I said, the Seven Sisters colleges are leading the way and are seen as the most elite institutions of higher education for women, but of course public institutions such as Ohio University are also in the mix here after the Civil War. But we have to remember at the time that Margaret Boyd comes here, in the spring of 1869, there are a lot of strong voices out there that are against higher education for women. And one is a man named Edward H. Clark of Harvard University Medical School. And in the year 1873, which is the year that Margaret Boyd will graduate from OU, he publishes a book entitled Sex in Education. So remember that name, Edward H. Clark, Clark with an E at the end, from Harvard Medical School, right? The most prestigious medical school in the country. He writes this best-selling book, and his argument is that higher education is dangerous for women. The belief among trained medical persons at this time was that the body had a finite supply of energy, and if one part of the body got too much effort and used too much energy, that energy would be sapped from other parts of the body. And in particular, Clark argued that women's pelvic power would be sapped if they used too much brain power. That if a woman overtaxed her brain in achieving college education, it would take away energy from her reproductive organs, and we would have race suicide. You know, if all these women and young girls went to college, we won't have another generation of Americans. And as I said, this guy had prestige, he had influence, and many people believed his arguments. At the time that Margaret Boyd is here at OU, there's a young woman from Baltimore who will eventually become president of one of the Seven Sisters colleges. She'll become president of Bryn Mawr. Her name is M. Carey Thomas. And she was born in 1857, so she's about 12 years old at the time that Margaret Boyd comes to OU as the first female student at this institution. And later in her life, she writes a little memoir, M. Carey Thomas, about her experiences as a girl and how frightened she was of getting a college education, although that's what she really wanted to do. So I thought I would read you just some brief excerpts from her memories of being 12, 13 years old at the time Margaret Boyd is a student here at OU. So this is what Carey Thomas says. I was always wondering whether it could really be true, as everyone thought, that boys were cleverer than girls. Indeed, I cared so much that I never dared to ask any grown-up person the direct question, not even my father or mother, because I feared to hear the reply. I remember often praying about it and begging God that if it were true that because I was a girl I could not successfully master Greek and go to college and understand things, to kill me at once, as I could not bear to live in such an unjust world. It was not to be wondered that we were uncertain in those days as to the ultimate result of women's education. Before I myself went to college, I had never seen but one college woman. I had heard that such a woman was staying at the house of an acquaintance. I went to see her with fear. Even if she had appeared in hoofs and horns, I was determined to go to college all the same. So I imagine little Carey Thomas, peeping through the neighbor's window. But it was a relief to find this Vassar graduate, tall and handsome, and dressed like other women. So she sees her first college-educated woman, and she's just like every other woman. So she's not going to be so scared. 5 years later, she goes to college. She goes to the women's college at Cornell, Sage College. We did not know when we began, when she and other members of her generation went to college, whether women's health could stand the strain of college education. We were haunted in those early days by the clanging chains of that gloomy little specter, Dr. Edward H. Clarke's Sex in Education. With trepidation of spirit, I made my mother read it, and was much cheered by her remark that, as neither she nor any of the women she knew had ever seen girls or women of the kind described in Dr. Clarke's book, we might as well act as if they did not exist, because the way he described college-educated women is they're pale, they're weak, they can barely, walk across the room. Still, we did not know whether colleges might not produce a crop of just such invalids. Doctors insisted that they would. We women could not be sure until we had tried the experiment. Now we have tried it, and tried it for more than a generation, and we know that college women are not only not invalids, but they are better physically than other women in their own class of life. So those were the kinds of intimidating messages that are out there when Maggie Boyd comes to Ohio University. Now, I was told to talk only 10 or 15 minutes. We look back to the 1860s and the 1870s and say, oh, those foolish Victorians, they knew nothing about how wonderful women are and how they can do anything in college that men can do, and they shouldn't be in a special classification. It was a talk by a woman named Beverly Price Jones, who in the 1970s had written, as a graduate student here at OU, a report on the status of women at Ohio University. And these are the notes I took on that occasion. In my own sloppy handwriting, on my own yellow legal pad here. Beverly Price Jones first came to OU in 1964. That's the year she started college. And every woman in that entering class of first-year students in 1964, fall of 1964, was issued what was called the Coed Handbook. And she said that its theme was "Be Ladylike." That was its thesis statement. And among the instructions, wear skirts. Okay, that meant every day when you go to class, wear skirts. Wear nylons and high heels on Sundays. Be in your dorms by 10 p.m. There was a separate judiciary system for women, separate from men, because they could get in trouble for doing a whole bunch of stuff that men wouldn't get in trouble for, such as they needed special permission for being out on a trip for a school activity, because not only did they have to be in their dorms at 10 at night, they couldn't leave their dorms before 7 in the morning. She said the only way to get out of the dorm as a female student at that time, that apparently, according to what she said on this occasion, if you were single, unmarried female student, you couldn't go off and live in your own apartment. The only way out of the dorm was to pledge a sorority, which she did, but then she left the sorority when they would not integrate. Of course, this is at the time of the Civil Rights Movement. Whatever sorority she pledged would not allow African American women in the sorority. She wrote about this experience in the Post, and then in, I guess, what we would call today an episode of shaming, she was hazed by a fraternity here on campus for speaking out. She didn't officially graduate when she should have in 1968 because she had written her honors thesis on a feminist topic for the English department, and the department wouldn't accept it. And so she didn't graduate in 1968 when she was supposed to, because the English department here at Ohio University, only 50 years ago, would not accept her honors thesis because it was written on a feminist topic. So she decided she wanted to stay in Athens, and she put an ad in, she says, in my notes it says in the paper, I don't know if she meant the Post, probably the Post, that people who wanted to talk about women's status and women's issues could join her at United Campus Ministries for a discussion on this topic. That caught the eye of the dean of the business college. Well, this is an enterprising young woman. He asked her if she'd be interested in, this is 1969 now, she's never officially graduated in 1968. In 1969, the dean of the business college said, would you be interested in being the first, 1969, the first MBA student, female MBA student here at Ohio University? And he promised her a sizable assistantship. Well, she'd never officially graduated the previous year because of the dust-up over her radical feminist honors thesis. But the dean of the business college pulled some strings, and she was able to get her diploma in 1969. She also apparently had a local radio show on WOUB, and because she had been in all of these very public controversies, over the non-integration of her sorority and her radical thesis, and she'd also married the editor of the Post because he was going to resist the draft. Of course, this is during the Vietnam War. And she wanted to be able to visit him in jail, and only family members could visit him in jail, so she married him. So that had gotten some publicity. Anyway, so she was in the public eye, and so President Claude Soule, who was president of the university in the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, called on her in the early 70s to investigate the status of women. And she says in part it was because she was a prominent graduate student because of her various activities, but she also said on this occasion 10 years ago she thought he also wanted to shut her up. And so to put her in charge of the problem, investigating the problem might stop her from making headlines, doing other things regarding the problem. But she also said on that occasion that she thinks that President Soule's wife, Katie, was an influence on his thinking about women's issues and his asking Beverly, then Price, now Beverly Price Jones, to take on this task. And I'm assuming that our other two panelists may talk about Beverly Price Jones' report on the status of women at Ohio University in the early 70s. So that gives context to what the other panelists will be talking about in the next several minutes.
My mother expected someone named John, and when I arrived, she just named me after herself. So we were two generations of Loises. I brought some things to show you, and I want to talk a little bit about things that were brought up. For instance, Dean Voigt. I spoke about Dean Voigt in connection with the talk that I gave on International Women's Day Festival. And Dean Voigt, one of the other things that she did was to work for about 6 years to get Ohio University accredited by the American Association of University Women. That was in 1927 that the AAUW branch was accredited. Because in those days, AAUW did a very good job of going around and checking on universities and seeing how they were treating the women students and faculty. And you had to meet certain expectations. Nowadays, they don't have to do that anymore because, for one thing, there are regional accreditation groups. But some people didn't make the cut. And in fact, my dear friend, Drusilla Everts, who was a professor of journalism, I'm not sure exactly when she retired. Did anyone here have Drew Everts as a journalism professor? She was very clear about knowing your P's and Q's as far as where all the commas go and that sort of thing. And they called her Drusilla the grammarian, I believe, Anyway,
journalism didn't make the cut because apparently there was a problem between Dean Voigt and the dean of the journalism school, and he didn't like the things that she was finding out that the AAUW wouldn't accept back in 1927. So for many years, the journalism graduates who were women, not that there were very many of them in those days, were not eligible for AAUW. We've heard about Beverly Price Jones, and I'm not sure what her maiden name was, but she married Tom Price, who was editor of the OU Post. And interestingly enough, later they divorced, and Tom Price married his new wife, who is someone that I know quite well, because she and I were on a committee back in 1977, which was setting up International Women's Year meetings. Now, most of the information that I have about problems with the status of women at Ohio University in the times that I've been around, and I've been around for 50 years here, come from a thesis that was written, and Catherine Jellison was on this man's committee, right? Mm-hmm. His name was Frank Robinson, and he got a degree, and I see Judy helped Frank Robinson find out a lot of this information. Robinson got his thesis finished, I believe, in the year 2000 in the College of Education. And he had a lot of oral history that he did with women, many of whom I know. I mean, in the list of women that he spoke with, which included me, was like 33 all told. And it was funny, you know, he has lots of good things to say about people, but he made a couple of big boners. And one of them was in saying that I was a founder of the American Association of University Women at Ohio University, which occurred in 1927, even before I was born, you know. So, so he also made a difficulty with my friend Susan, now Susan Price. She was Susan Frampton in those days, in the 1970s. She was working at Ohio University. She was sort of a colleague, really, of Beverly Price Jones, because they were working together at the same time. But she was the first president of the chapter of the National Organization for Women here at Athens. And she went with me to this committee in 1977, which planned this International Women's Year meeting in Ohio, in Columbus. And I have some material here from that. This was from 1976. And it was a follow-up to the Mexico City International Women's Year meeting. You know, there have been at least 3 great meetings of the international women. The first was in Mexico City in 1975. Then in 1985, they met, I believe, in Kenya. It was in Africa. And in 1995, they met in China. And this year is Beijing plus 20. It's also, of course, Mexico City plus 40. Well, it was a big meeting. The Department of State was involved. They had meetings in every state and territory of the United States and so on. And Frank Robinson thought that when Susan Frampton went to Houston in 1977 in the fall, that she went to a NOW conference. She went to the national meeting of the International Women's Year that was held in Houston in 1977. And I have some materials here from that, including this called The Spirit of Houston, which I'm going to pass around for two reasons. One is that it shows the T-shirt from International Women's Year. And this lady, I think, might be someone you saw.
Yes,
Catherine.
yeah.
Isn't
Peggy
that-
Kokernut. Yeah.
From Columbus.
Columbus.
Was
She's an
one of
animal rights
the
activist.
women who, there were 3 women who carried the torch the last mile in Houston. It went from Seneca Falls to Houston in 1977. That's this white woman here is from Columbus. But I'll pass that around so you can see the picture of the Spirit of Houston. Well, so she didn't go to, Susan Frampton Price today did not go to a NOW convention. She went to the national meeting itself. Anyway, Frank Robinson has a lot of good things, good accurate things to say about the problems that women had at Ohio University in the 1970s. And many of them had to do with money, of course. Money being always very important. And having to do with faculty, women having lower amounts of money in their paychecks than men in general. And one of the things that happened in the 70s was that a particularly lowly paid section of the university was the School of Music. In fact, my husband and I had a friend named Barbara Gary, who's been away from Ohio University now for many, many years, decades actually. But she was a pianist at the School of Music. She was on the faculty as a pianist. And the reason she left Ohio University was that she discovered that she was the lowest paid person in the whole university on the faculty. School of Music had, later in the late 70s, it had 6 women faculty out of a total school of about over 30 people. And they discovered, you know, sort of similar to Barbara Gary, that they were not being paid very well. And they put up a fuss. Especially the person who put up the fuss was Pauline Gagliano. Professor Gagliano has been in the, I guess he's retired now, of course, but he was in the political science department for many years. And it was his wife, Pauline Gagliano, who was the person who led the revolt, so to speak, in the School of Music beginning in 1978. And they had a rather uncomfortable 2 years about this. Like I say, there were only 6 women who were on the faculty in those days. And finally, Pauline Gagliano, finding that there wasn't much going on in terms of changes being made, filed a suit with the Office of Enforcement. I can't remember what it's called, but you know, the one that deals with Title IX and problems of discrimination against women. And there was more movement after that came down, you know. Hey, all of a sudden they discover there's been a federal lawsuit filed by Pauline Gagliano about this situation at Ohio University. And so they had, you know, they really looked closely at the situation and decided to help the women, and they gave them substantial amount of money. Some of them got fairly substantial amount of money, like $5,000 in terms of sort of making up for all the years they hadn't paid them so well. And they raised their salaries generally. Another person who was involved with that very much was Lucille Jennings. Lucille Jennings was the harpist, and her husband was on the School of Music faculty. He was a pianist, and he's still around, you know, but he's retired, of course. And Lucille died a couple of years ago. But after OU made some changes, you know, this kind of changes, then the Pauline Gagliano withdrew her suit in 1979, and things were a little bit better, you know, then. But that was definitely a problem. And in this oral history, there are a lot of quotes that Frank Robinson had of things that women said to him about the way they had been treated and mistreated, you know, often at Ohio University in terms of money and other things. For instance, if you go to Alden Library and look at the 3rd floor, you will notice a whole wall of men, distinguished professors. And to choose a new distinguished professor, you have to be chosen by a committee. Now, it turns out there is only one distinguished professor who is a woman, and she was named in the 1990s. That's namely Gladys Balin, who is the dance, you know, a dance person. She's retired now, too. But why no distinguished women? Who knows, except that all the committees that make the choices are the men who are all the other people who are the distinguished professors. So, you know, that's the kind of thing that happens. And I brought one more picture, sort of, that I would like to show you, because this has to do with the era about which we're talking. Judy Daso will recognize this picture, right, Judy? Mm-hmm. In fact, Judy sent me this picture. It's from the Athens Messenger on July 2nd, 1982. Anybody know what was important about July 2nd, 1982? What?
It was the end of ERA eligibility.
Yeah, thank you. My son David knows the answer. It was the day after the expiration of the Equal Rights Amendment, which was passed in 1973 and extended for 3 years in 1979, but expired on June 30th, 1982. And in this picture, I'm up here addressing this crowd that met at the courthouse. A new day for the Equal Rights Amendment. Well, here we are, many a long year later, and the Equal Rights Amendment, I think it's brought up every time Congress meets, but nothing ever happens with it. And there's this question, well, could they count all the states that passed it back between 1973 and 1982? Well, I guess not. And you know, Ohio was one of the very last. Ohio was the 34th state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, and that was in 1974. They never got any more states, all the southern states, plus Illinois, where Phyllis Schlafly hangs out, or maybe she hangs out across the river in Missouri, I'm not sure. They just never got to the required 37 states. And a few states have unratified it because there have been people who say, equal rights, you know, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States on account of sex. That's it. Very simple. But it never has passed, partly because there's a great deal of conservative opposition to the notion of the Equal Rights Amendment. Well, anyway, probably that's as much as I need to tell you, except that this is, as I say, 1976, getting ready for the International Women's Year meetings, which happened in 1977. And this is the report of the Ohio meeting. I was on that committee, as I said, and it was a very interesting meeting. Ohio was one of half a dozen states that sent a basically conservative delegation to Houston. Susan Frampton went, and there were 11 women of the 56-member delegation who were, quote, liberals, including Susan Frampton, later Price. But, and as I say, about 6 other states sent a conservative group, but most of the others sent people who were more in favor of the 14 things that women, you know, could look to or should look to improve their status. So I'm not saying much specifically, as you can see, about this status of women at Ohio University, but if you can, I have some material here from Frank Robinson's dissertation, if you'd be interested in looking at it. And you can read those, can't you? I mean, you can, dissertations are at the library.
Yeah, that was before. I think they were all digitized, so it's a bound copy in the library.
There is a bound copy of it there. So if you're really interested, why, you can take a look at it. And these other things are like, this is a picture that was made in 1977, which actually shows me and the head of our committee, who was a Southern Ohio woman named Mary Egerton Miller. And interestingly enough, among the people who was asked to stand for delegate status was a woman from Zanesville who was Mary D. Miller. Well, guess who went to Houston? Mary D. Miller went to Houston as an elected delegate. Actually, Mary E. Miller also went as a special, you know, appointee, but that was the situation there, and it was a very interesting time. I was president of the League of Women Voters from 75 to 77, and we took on Congressman Miller, who was our congressman, who lived in Lancaster and was our congressman for about 20 years at least. Because it turned out he was the #1 opponent of funding for the National Conference of International Women's Year. He tried mightily on several occasions to get rid of all the funding for the national conference. And in fact, they did cut it down from $10 million for 56 states and territories to $5 million. But they did get the $5 million, and so they were able to have the national conference in Houston in the fall of 1977. So, and we put up a fuss in Athens about Congressman Miller's big effort to defund the National Women's Conference. But a lot of other people in his district were much in favor of it, defunding that is, like the people in Lancaster who were members of Eagle Forum, Phyllis Schlafly's group. And also, of course, the other big opponents were the members of Right to Life Ohio. So between Right to Life Ohio and Eagle Forum, 45 of the delegates who went to Houston were members of those groups. So anyway, I guess that's enough.
Well, this is Lois Whaley again with Madison Koenig, my guest and Women's Affairs Commissioner at the Ohio University Student Senate. And I want to correct a couple of things I said. the other night, one of the things I said was, look at the third floor and all the pictures of the distinguished professors. And Gladys Balin is the only one there. Well, I went up there and I actually counted them. There are over 60 men. There are over 60 men, many of whom I knew myself, over the years. Wonderful guys, all distinguished professors at Ohio University. But there are 3 distinguished professors who are women. And they all date from the late 20th century. Ursula Belden of theater in the 1880s, and then in the 1980s, and then in the 1990s, Lois Vines, who was in Romance Languages, and Gladys Balin of dance. And then there's one more woman, it's Patricia Richard, of political science. They're all retired now, of course. She was trustee professor because she had served in the administration before she was a professor, after, that sort of thing. But she was a trustee professor like Sam Crowell and like Dr. Gammersfelder and others.
Right.
So there are only 4.
Still a little disproportionate.
A little disproportionate, yeah. There are dozens of men and not that many women. And the other thing, the picture that showed in 1977 and the last lap going into Houston in 1977, and it shows Bella Abzug in the hat, and then this white woman in the middle is someone from Columbus.
Wow.
Peggy Coconut, whom Dr. Jellison actually met on a plane one time.
Really?
And she didn't realize that pictures of her were famous, in women's studies books and things like that. And then over here is Betty Friedan. So
Very
that's
cool.
an important picture from that time. And then I show this poster from 1977, which was Woman's Place, Pride and Prejudice. And that was a humanities conference that I directed in 1977. I can't believe how many things I did that year, including having a graduating senior in high school.
It's a busy time for you.
It was a very busy time. And then there's a picture from the 1980s showing the day after the expiration of the Equal Rights Amendment, which was a picture that I showed on camera, but I thought that would give a better close-up. And there I am up at the microphone at the courthouse steps. And shortly after the picture was taken, we were asked to leave because someone had phoned into the courthouse a threat.
Oh.
Yeah, and
Really?
we had 10 women lined up to speak. 3 of them had spoken, and the sheriff came and said, "You ladies are going to have to leave." And we said, "What are you going to do?" And someone said, "Let's go to College Green." And so we marched off to College Green, and we did finish there, but we didn't have a microphone there and all that sort of thing. Women's voices, again, taken down. Well, tell us something about Take Back the Night this year.
Yeah, so Take Back the Night will start next week. We're going to have events, at least 2 events every day, starting on Monday.
Wow.
But the big march and keynote speech will happen on Thursday
On
evening.
Thursday. I remembered that it was usually on Thursday.
Yeah.
I was a speaker once about 15, 20 years ago. And so I'm not really up to marching much anymore, but
Yeah, but we have, I think, a pretty good variety of events that hopefully will touch on a lot of different subjects that people are interested in. We're doing an event with the ROTC program about sexual violence in the military, but we're also talking about women of color dealing with sexual violence, and we're talking about people dealing with intimate partner violence in LGBT communities. So I think that we're going to have some pretty varied programming.
it sounds like it. And so there's something practically every night?
More than practically, definitely every night.
Definitely every night. And that starts, then that would be April 13th or so, wouldn't
Yep,
it?
13th through the 17th.
13th through the 17th of April. And are the events mostly at Baker Center, or are they over?
They're around campus.
Around campus.
We also, on Friday, we're having 2 events off campus. We're having a discussion about how the week went at the United Campus Ministries, starting at noon. And then at 3:30, we're going to do a self-defense workshop for women at the Athens Public Library with My Sister's Place in the Women's Rural Recovery Program.
Right. Well, you know, I remember reading just yesterday, I think it was in the A News, was it in the A News or the Post? You were quoted extensively
Yeah.
about gun violence and, you know, should people be permitted to carry concealed weapons?
Yeah. Well, I'm a member of an activist group on campus called F-Rape Culture. So I've been working with a lot of survivors of sexual assault for the last 2 years, and nobody really wants concealed carry on campus because nobody who survives sexual violence wants that, because they recognize that that means perpetrators will also have weapons, and that just makes the whole situation even more violent.
Right, and you never can tell. I mean, and, a lot of suicides come from people who do have guns and so forth. Now, I was raised, you know, in a family where my father and brother went deer hunting every fall and that sort of thing, so I'm quite used to having weapons around and the whole idea, but they're very dangerous. So that was quite interesting what they had to say about.
I'm glad you enjoyed the article.
Yes, yes. And you were just one of a number of people who was quoted on that. It was a very thought-provoking article. Yeah. Well, this is Lois Whaley, and my guest has been Madison Koenig, and she's Women Affairs Commissioner for Ohio University Student Senate. So, well, good luck on Take Back the Night.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today.
Well, I enjoyed having you very much. This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.